right. Hello, welcome everyone. We're starting a couple minutes behind, so I'm just going to jump right in so we can have as much time as we can with Martin Wolf. We're very honored to have him back with us at Network 2020, albeit virtually this time. He does have to leave right at the hour, so we'll end a couple minutes short, just letting everybody know. So, and also so Martin, you know that we are aware of your timing. What I'd like to do today, just as a very brief intro, my name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. Just very quickly, we are a nonprofit organization. We're based in New York, and we're really trying to create more informed dialogue around what's happening in the international affairs world, as well as have impact in that world as well. So please do check our website for more information about some of the many programs that we run. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome back Martin Wolf. We've been fortunate to have him speak to us in person a number of times in New York over the years. And although it's not quite the same, we are very pleased to have him with us virtually today. So I'll just give the top line of his very distinguished career, but he is the associate editor and chief economics commentator at the wonderful Financial Times in London. And he was also ordered the Command of the British Empire in 2000 for services to financial journalism. I think he is, on a personal note, one of the best of the best. And so we are really fortunate to have him with us today to walk us through what's happening in the UK right now. So with that, welcome back, Martin. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our conversation, even if it's a slightly depressing subject.
Well, I know there's a lot of depressing economic news out there, but I feel from the vantage point in the US, whenever we're hearing about the depressing economic news, it always seems to be overshadowed by that which might be happening in the UK. So we're interested in learning more about what's going on. Okay. I would like to start with just a really brief scene setter so that we're all on the same page. Could you just give us a brief overview of the current UK economic crisis? What are some of the major factors that you see contributing to where the country is right now and where the economic situation stands?
It's quite difficult to do this without going back a bit. So I won't go back all the way to 1870, which is where I think it all starts. I'm not joking. Remember, this is a very old country, but probably to the financial crisis, because I don't think we're going to really understand it where we are without that. So up to the financial crisis from about 1990 or so it's about 17 years, we seem to be growing rather strongly. Our productivity growth looked to be faster, not much, but faster than those of the major European economies, comparing pretty well with the US. Real incomes per head were rising, and inequality was not worsening. So it worsened a lot in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher's regime, but then stabilized at a lower level than the US, though it's a relatively unequal economy among the larger developed countries otherwise. But between say 1990 or really 1992 to 2007, things looked pretty good. And this turned out to be a mirage, or at least ex post it seems to be a mirage. The global financial crisis hit UK very hard because we're very exposed to the financial sector. London is a very big financial center, one of the two biggest with New York, and of course relatively large compared to the UK economy, compared with the New York in the US. And the financial sector basically stopped generating fast growth in income or measured productivity, always very different in the financial sector after that. We also lost the oil sector simply because, which had also been very important, because we ran out of oil. And finally, activities in the service sector started being less dynamic too. A lot of that was to do with what happened to the housing sector after the financial crisis. And we then discovered that our actual trend productivity growth was not at all as we thought, but actually very, very weak. It collapsed. We had the largest decline in productivity growth of any G7 country between the pre-crisis and the post-crisis period. And the result has been very roughly that real incomes, real wages, per head, real incomes per head, real wages, obviously per head, have been pretty well stagnant since 2007. We have not experienced this as a country since the 19th century and probably the early 19th century. So this is unprecedented. And so to give you a rough idea, I had this chart in my forthcoming book. So if you compare our GDP per head now with what it would have been if the pre-2007 trend had continued, it's now 30% below it. So that's really dramatic. By the way, the US is 20% below. I mean, we have all experienced dramatic declines relative to trend, except Germany, interestingly, among the G7 countries. I can discuss why. So we are much poorer than we expected to be. That's the biggest single point. And trying to understand why is the crucial thing. Then, of course, we bring it up to date. We have made a number of pretty serious policy mistakes, of which the most important was Brexit, which further worsened, which I think explains the additional worsening in our relative position, because our trade opportunities have diminished, our trade has been less dynamic, investment has been pretty well stagnant since Brexit, because I think people both abroad and at home don't see much investable opportunity. And that's the second big shock, the Brexit shock. And I think that the Brexit shock is partly to be explained by the consequences of the first shock, the austerity and the weakening of the growth of the economy after 2007 made lots of people unhappy, already been somewhat unhappy with the deindustrialization under Margaret Thatcher. And then it all came together and they were offered a sort of magic potion to solve all these problems called Brexit. And they, unfortunately, 52%, slightly less of the population took it. And that created a whole new period of uncertainty during which investment has been the weakest of any major Western country by far, and the productivity growth has continued to be very low. And we have come out of the pandemic with a more feeble economy again than any other major developed countries. So we've come to look a bit like Italy, which has actually had stagnant GDP per head since 2000, and we have been pretty stagnant since 2007. As a result of these processes. Now, finally, I know it's taking a little time, but you'll have to bring this up to date. Then, of course, like other European countries, but unlike the US, we've been hit by this massive energy price shock because we are a net importer of gas now. We're no longer self-sufficient. And though we don't import directly from Russia, the European gas market is integrated. So all the prices have rose a great deal, though they've now fallen a lot, thank heavens, but that pushed up inflation crazily to sort of really high levels. And of course, for us, this was a terms of trade shock. That is to say, import prices rose relative to our export prices. That's not true for the US because you're self-sufficient in oil and gas. So this is a big real income shock, and we call it the cost of living crisis. And it's very, very substantial. In general, this has pushed real pay down for most people in our economy, but particularly the public sector's employees, because the government doesn't want to raise taxes. And so it's essentially deciding to reduce real wages of its employees. That's leading to lots of strikes, which we can see in the news all the time, and inevitable consequence of such high inflation. And of course, again, in response to high inflation, the Bank of England is raising rates, as the Fed is doing, with very similar increases, though we're behind the Fed and will probably go on up and past it sometime in the next 6 months or so. So on top of these two longer term problems, the very, very weak growth of productivity and the shock of Brexit, we now have this cost of living crisis. as in which has imposed very large cuts in real incomes in the short run for a lot of the population, a real labor strife, which we haven't seen since the 70s, and a government which has now been in power since 2010, looks completely out to lunch, as it were, doesn't know what it's doing, and has gone through 3 prime ministers, as you know, within a year. One of them for only 44 days, and that's partly because they made a mess of things for 13 years. They made an additional mess over 7 years since Brexit, and now they're hit by this massive crisis, which they don't really know what to do about. So that, as briefly as I can possibly make it, is where we are.
Thank you. That was a bleak and quick scene set, and I really appreciate it. So now, moving on into the looking ahead part, what policies do you think that the UK government can set to really achieve better economic resilience going forward? And, when you're looking at the political picture, what challenges do you see in implementing solutions?
Well, the first thing to note that it's really difficult. They face short-term problems, which I've described. Real incomes have fallen, and people are very upset about this. They have a very difficult fiscal position with large deficits, which they're trying to contain. Our debt has risen from about 30% of GDP before the financial crisis, a little over that, to close to 100 now, a bit less than that, as a result of the series of shocks that I've talked about: the financial crisis, the Brexit crisis, and above all, COVID. And now the energy crisis, because they're trying to cushion that. So we've got large increases in debt and deficits quite large. So the government's ability to spend more is very limited unless it raises taxes, and it's very difficult to raise taxes on people who are not having increased real incomes, because it actually reduces their real incomes when a lot of them are already in some trouble. So the government is quite constrained by the short run position. It's very difficult to do anything ambitious and imaginative in this situation. It also only has about a couple of years to go, perhaps the maximum, I think, 2.5 before the next election. So that's not the time when you can do very ambitious things. And the Tory party is deeply divided, indeed almost completely dysfunctional, between what you might call the Brexit ultras, who want to burn everything to do with the EU, forget that it's there, go in for some sort of ultra-free market, libertarian economy, which slash taxes and welfare. There's no chance they will be allowed to do that, but they can stop the government doing anything else. Then there are sort of the more traditional Tories, who basically the people behind Rishi, but they're still Brexiters. And then there's still some who really think we should do a much better job of getting close to Europe. So they're very divided, and they're very frightened of the public opinion, which shows that they're going to be demolished in the next election. And that means they really don't want to do anything very unpopular. So those are the constraints. And the truth is that any major policy that they could implement with a view to improving the position would take some time to have an effect. There is no magic bullets here. They have to raise investment, raise the rate of innovation, find some way of creating new and more dynamic companies, exploiting our competitive advantages where they exist. And none of this will be very easy, because by now, after 15 years of stagnation, it's become very difficult for people to feel optimistic enough about the future to go in for really, big entrepreneurial ventures. The economy just looks quite moribund. One way of looking at that is you look at our stock market, There are almost no important new companies in it in the last 20 years, very different from the US, or even longer than that. It's a very old economy, stock market. We have a very weak capital market. Our pension funds are incredibly conservative. This is not an environment in which it's difficult for, in which it's easy for government to change the trajectory.
Thank you for that. I know we're not at the Q&A portion right now, but I myself had a question come to mind, and I'm seeing it reflected in some of the questions in the Q&A box. You've given some broad strokes about the UK economy in terms of inequality and in terms of the GDP per head and that declining. Is there anything when you parse the data that stands out to you, particularly about how the decline in GDP per head is spread, as well as inequality? Is there anything that stands out in terms of the overall divide or different divisions within the country that are surprising or noteworthy?
Well, the most interesting data on this, they are quite interesting, is that in the 80s and up to the mid-90s or so, maybe the late 90s, but mostly in the 80s, real incomes per head were growing reasonably fast, but they were growing very, very unequally. So they were growing particularly fast for not the top 1%, but the top few deciles, let's say. And they were growing very, very little at the bottom. So in that period, particularly in the Thatcher era, the result of that was, though we had rising real GDP per head, inequality was rising very quickly. Then after that, there was a period of reasonably fast growth, sort of in the mid-90s to early 2000s, reasonably fast growth, when inequality was not rising. And particularly this was true under the Labour government from 97 to 2007. And real GDP per head seemed to be growing strongly. So this was different from the US, where inequality continued to rise. I'm talking about income. I'm not going to talk about wealth because that raises a whole set of other questions. And for most people, I think income inequality is most relevant because they live on their incomes, not on assets. Like as in the US, most people's assets are relatively limited at the bottom 5 deciles anyway. So there was this second period. So the first period was reasonably fast growth of GDP per head, but very unequally shared in terms of growth. Then a period, quite a longish period, from the mid-90s to about 2007, when it was reasonably fast growth in GDP per head and rather equal. That would look lovely. That's why we were much more optimistic 20 years ago or so than we are now. And then since the financial crisis, interestingly, on income inequality doesn't seem to have got worse at all. It's just, at least not significantly by standard measures. I'm not looking at the very, very top, top 0.1% or something, just overall. And but real income hasn't been growing. So everybody has been equally miserable, if you like. Inequality hasn't got worse, but the overall level of GDP per head has been basically growing very, very slowly, and real household disposable income has been stagnant too, and real earnings, as I said. So those are the 3 periods we've had since 1980. And obviously the ideal one is the one we had in the middle, when we had reasonably fast growth of GDP per head, reasonably equally shared. But now we're not finding inequality get worse. It's not. But unfortunately, that's not helped if actually nobody's getting better off at all.
Thank you. That is very helpful. So you spoke a lot earlier about some of the short-term constraints. What are you looking for in the next few months in terms of the UK economy, and sort of what major benchmarks are you keeping an eye out for, or your colleagues keeping an eye out for, to see which direction things are going in?
Well, I suppose in the short run, leave aside, I think it's very implausible that we're going to see any dramatic policy change. We had this upheaval around the fall of Boris Johnson and the fall of Liz Truss, we've now got a Prime Minister and Chancellor who are pretty sort of sober, middle of the road sort of conservatives, centre-right, basically. They put a high priority on fiscal prudence, not going in for huge tax cuts which are unfunded. The conclusion from the Truss period is that we can't afford to do that. We don't have the freedom of maneuver that the US would have, for example, for pretty obvious reasons. So they're not going to cut taxes if they're going to do it at all until close to the election, because they're going to try and buy votes, and we're not there yet. They can't spend a lot more. So there are going to be some regulatory changes, I think, but they're very complicated because they're to do with how we get rid of the legislation that is in effect from our period in the EU. I can talk about that separately, but it's a complicated issue. But leaving aside this sort of the EU, the retained law, the desire to get rid of EU retained law, which is a very, very significant issue, nothing dramatic otherwise is going to happen. So in the short term, by which I mean the next year or so, the crucial issue is how we bring the inflation under control. So we've got very high inflation and it's falling because gas prices are falling, and indeed because of the base level effect, gas prices, of course, changes are massively negative because they were so high just 6 months, 8 months ago, after the Ukraine war. The post-COVID big global price surge is also falling out of the indices. So again, that will lower headline inflation. But there's a real worry about core inflation because big factor there is wages. And people are trying very, very hard to raise their wages to regain the lost real income. So that's a big issue in terms of our inflation process, and it's politically, obviously, incredibly sensitive and difficult. In that context, the crucial issues are, where does inflation go? Second, in curbing inflation, how tight does the Bank of England go? Its rates are a little bit below those of the Fed, but they could go higher. And the third level issue, which is very important, is whose real income is squeezed in the process of adjusting inflation. In other words, how much of it will fall on profits and how much will it fall on real incomes, real wages? And my guess is that in the end, quite a bit will fall on profits because we are poorer than we were, because there is a negative terms of trade shock, not as big as we thought. And of course, if profits are squeezed, there is a risk that will make investment even weaker. So in looking ahead, I'm looking at these three things, essentially, what happens to inflation and its nature, what happens to Bank of England monetary policy, and how far is the squeezing of real incomes in this context to bring inflation back under control, which will include some decline in output. How much of this is going to be borne by wages and how much of it is going to be borne by profits? And I suppose a fourth thing, which is crucial in this process, is how much, in order to make this monetary policy work, will unemployment rise? Because one of the good things about the economy, and that's important to stress, is we have low unemployment by historical standards, and the result is, it's more like the US, as it were. We have low unemployment. Now, it's partly, again, because participation has fallen here. People have withdrawn from the labor market, which is very worrying. I haven't stressed this, unlike the rest of Europe, but I think it's happened in the US too. People have left the labor market. So we're more like that. That seems to be related, at least in part, to ill health. So we seem to have a particularly severe health problem after COVID, and that's related to the failure in part of the health system, which is another issue. But the big things I would focus on, as I said, inflation, inflation, the distribution of incomes between wages and profits, monetary policy, and unemployment. And over the next year, inflation will fall, monetary policy will be tight, there will be a squeeze on real incomes, and I think unemployment is bound to rise. How much, we don't know.
Thank you. So that's short term. And before I go to the Q&A, I'd love to just get in one more question that's a little looking more at the longer term. So in your mind, what would it take to achieve economic resilience in the long term? And I realize it's hard to have a crystal ball, probably particularly as an economist when there are so many factors at hand. But what do you think the UK economy needs?
Well, there's a simple thing we can do in the shortish run, and then there's some really big long-term challenges. So we have to resolve our situation vis-a-vis Europe. I mean, it is our most important trading partner. In my view, it will always be our most important trading partner. I've always thought that Brexit was a huge strategic error, economically and politically, for the UK. I don't think it can be reversed in the short to medium term, though interestingly, all the polls here suggest that the public has changed their view on Brexit. And at the time of the Brexit poll, as you know, the vote was very close to 50-50, 52-48, slightly less. And now the polls pretty consistently showing that only 1/3 are in favor of Brexit. So one could imagine, as the old people die off and more of the younger people who really want to go back in become the electorate, that maybe this will be reversed. But it is crucial to stress that the EU itself has changed a lot. The demands of going in are much greater than they were. And in addition, we have lost all the opt-outs we had. So going in, there's this famous sentence of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus that you can never step into the same river twice. Well, we can't step into the same EU twice. So that's a big thing. And so we can't just reverse what we did because it was stupid. But we do have to improve our current relationship with the EU and get the closest we can to free trade with it. We have to solve the problems over the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, which I can discuss if you want. And we need, I think, to go back into the regulatory regimes of the EU. There's no value in our having independent regulatory regimes for our producers. It just adds to cost, obviously, in trade more generally. So that means going back as far as we can into the single market. I think there's no point in our having our own trade policy. We thought we'd have great big deals with India, China, the US. None of those are going to happen. So I think we should rejoin the customs union. And that means that on the economic side, we will be substantially back in the EU. If we were in the single market in the customs union, we will be substantially back in the EU. There will be a lot of political problems with doing this, but I would hope, though I'm not optimistic, that that's what Keir Starmer would like to do if he becomes Prime Minister, as I expect. I don't think he will. I think he's too frightened of it because it splits his party as it splits the Conservatives. I think this is one of the important points, that Brexit cuts across both parties, though a little less than it used to. But anyway, Labour is more pro-EU and the Conservatives less than they used to be. Remember, the Conservatives used to be the pro-EU party. Remember this. That's very, very important. So there have been big shifts, just as in the US, the Conservative Party, the Republican Party have shifted their positions on so many policies. Now, so the EU is very, very important. If we could fix that, would improve the investment environment. Then I think we have to look, there are a lot of big policy issues. We need to radically increase incentives to invest in our corporate tax. We need radical improvement of our pension regimes and our pension funds to encourage more risk-taking that has complex regulatory aspects. It's almost impossible to build things in the UK because of planning regulations. This is a very small country. Building new things is very sensitive. It's rather different from the US, where space is so freely available, at least relatively freely available. But still, it's almost impossible to build anything. This makes it difficult to start new activities. It also makes it difficult for people to move where jobs are, because there aren't any new homes where they want to go, and prices can be so high, particularly in London. We need, we need to really work very, very hard to encourage link up between our universities and our businesses, to encourage new technology. You know, we're a relatively good startup economy, but we also need, as I said, these reforms of the capital markets to encourage much more venture capital. And there will have to be some government support here. It can't all be done by the private sector in the UK, because it's not really, doesn't have the same strengths as the American one. So there's a whole host of things. We need to improve our skill base. There are large parts of our education, particularly for the people who don't go to university, which are not very effective. That's longer term. This is the field of expertise of my wife. So we need a growth strategy. Policies and so forth, which is quite long term. And I don't expect it to bear fruit quickly. So the thing that we can do that will bear fruit most quickly is to make ourselves more completely part of the EU economy and create an environment in which foreign firms, both European and non-European, consider Britain an obvious place to locate. After all, we have the advantage of the English language. We have the advantage of a well-respected legal system and what used to be considered reasonably stable political institutions. Whether that's still true is a question, and those are an obvious basis for future growth. But none of that is going to happen before the next election. Then we will have to see where our politics go.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box now, and there's a lot of great questions that are reflective of what you've been saying. So I'm going to try to pick up some of those threads. And if you're listening and would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. So I'd like to pick up the thread that you were talking about, moving closer to the EU. And we have a question, actually a couple of questions, I'll try to compile them, from a former EU diplomat who wants to know, what sort of government do you think is needed in order to move the UK closer to the EU? And also related to that, what are Sir Keir's chances? I think you mentioned, you think he's a little bit concerned about getting into the fray, but what are the chances of him winning the next election, and how might he handle that situation?
Well, if you look at the polls at the moment, the Labour's lead is colossal. I think it's about 20 percentage points. So this is landslide territory. And that's not very surprising, because it's pretty obvious. The performance and behavior of the Conservative government has been a catastrophe. I mean, just a political statement, in the sense that, look at that. First, we had austerity, which was very unpopular. Then we had Brexit, which has created and continues to create upheaval. So we've had 7 years since, so not quite 7 years yet, it will be 7 years in June, and during which we're constantly debating and going back over this Brexit story, and how we haven't, Boris Johnson got elected on the promise of getting Brexit done, but it isn't done. We're still worrying about Northern Ireland. The trade relationship, we still haven't introduced our supposed import barriers on our side, because they're obviously too costly. Whole slew of EU activities we'd like to be part of, but that haven't been resolved or may never be resolved. So-called Horizon project on science and so forth. So Brexit hasn't been done. The government has been beset by terrible scandals. That's drove Boris out, mainly to do with unequal application of Brexit, COVID rules. Then we had the overthrow of Brexit, of Johnson, replaced by Liz Truss, whose government imploded in a financial crisis very, very quickly. So the simple truth is, from the British public's point of view, this party has been in power for 12 years. Real incomes are stagnant. Our economic relations and other relations with Europe are far and away our most important partners are in a total mess. The government is beset by scandals and incompetence. So normally you'd expect them to be wiped out in a general election, and that's what the polls are showing. Now, can they recover? I have no idea. One thing I don't try to predict is elections, but you have to say, looking at British history, the overwhelming likelihood is that the Tories will be defeated. And my view is they have to be defeated because they're no longer a functioning governing party. They're exhausted, they have no ideas, and they're mostly incompetent. Now, that then obviously leads to the question, so it'd be very dispiriting if that's the best we can do. That leads to the question of what Keir Starmer's government will be like. Now, Starmer, I think, is a decent man, and I have a lot of sympathy with a lot of his attitudes, but his basic position has been, we mustn't say or do anything that looks controversial. We must not raise the European, we must basically stand there and let the government defeat itself. And by the way, the governments have been doing a great job of defeating itself. So that's a perfectly reasonable position for him to take, because he could possibly get into power without actually committing himself to almost anything. And that's basically what they've tried to do. The difficulty with that is you get into power having basically committed yourself to nothing. And that means that the people aren't prepared for anything. They aren't, that you have no legitimacy in introducing dramatic new policies because you haven't discussed them. Now, my view in British history, it's a bit different, I think, in the States because the presidential election is so personal. But here, you know, the manifesto matters because the manifesto gives a government a program for legislation and action, and the government can argue against those who object to it. Well, it's in the manifesto. It's what we were elected to do. Now, if nothing is in the manifesto, it's just sort of an empty box, empty, blank sheets of paper. They can't argue that. And then as soon as they start to do things, first there will be lots of fighting in the party because some people will object to everything you want to do. And they will say, well, you don't have a manifesto in justification for doing it. And in the end, governments that don't have clear commitments to doing something end up doing nothing, and they won't do any of the things I talked about. So I'm concerned that for perfectly understandable reasons, Mr. Starmer thinks this government is defeating itself. I don't want the Labour Party to become a topic of discussion. I want them to be the topic of discussion. And the way I ensure that the Labour Party isn't the topic of discussion is that I don't say anything that anyone can object to. But there is a downside to that, which is in the end, when you get into power, you don't really have any legitimacy to do anything, and the country continues to decline. And that does concern me. But that, I think, is where we are. The likelihood, in my perception, is that Starmer will win, probably with a tolerably big majority, even though Labour has now lost Scotland. He can offset this if the Tories are badly enough hit. The rise of the Liberal Democrats will take a lot of Tory seats too. That's important in a first-past-the-post system with multiple parties, which you don't have. And he will sit there with a big majority and he won't actually know what to do. And that would be very, very depressing. And that, I think, is the most likely situation.
Oh, well, that's rather bleak.
Well, I'm an observer. I'm just telling you what I think will happen. I've already said that I think he should be bolder. He should propose quite radical reforms in our international relations, our economic policy. He has to spend more on some important distributional programs, particularly and that means he's going to have to raise taxes on relatively well-off people. It's difficult to do this politically, but I think he has to do it. And, I sort of think I should pay more tax, as it were. I don't see how else he's going to do, because he can't really borrow much more. I mean, it begins to get worrying if we start our public debt keeps shooting up. Our deficits are higher than other developed countries. We've already seen with Liz Truss that that's really quite risky. So he is in a box, but he has to be brave about opening up this box.
Hopefully that message gets through. We have a couple of questions. I'll bundle them because they're similar. So one is there anything that would attract a major business or financial institution to make a significant investment in the UK? And then there is another that is, why is there a lack of vision or incentive to trigger new age sectors like a green economy instead of always defaulting to finance, which includes the whole tax haven regime? We have some of the best universities, entrepreneurs, and yet they get snapped up from VCs, et cetera. So what does it take to kind of innovate in this economy and attract investment?
Oh, what was the first question? Was it that was the first?
What would it take to what would it take to attract big investment?
Oh, yes. I mean, interestingly, I'm not very much a fan of Boris, but I would, or even the Conservative government, we've actually not done a bad job. We haven't done a great job on greening our economy, particularly in the electricity generation field. I mean, the growth of wind power in particular has been quite dramatic. So if I remember the figures correctly, about half of our electricity on average is now generated by renewables. That's been an important form of resilience. And that has been linked to very deliberate policies by the government to encourage the electricity supply industry to bring in a lot of renewable generation into the power network. So we've done fairly well on that, and that's brought in quite a lot of firms to do that sort of thing. There are other areas of greening the economy where progress, I think, has been fairly much less substantial, and that's partly because they're really difficult. They involve, at least a lot of them are very difficult because they involve quite big choices. I mean, for example, at the moment, home heating in the UK largely relies, for historical reasons, on gas, which went back to the 60s. Now, obviously, the high prices of gas will shift this, but moving from a gas-based heating system to one based on electric heating using renewables involves, one, an enormous expansion in generation, and two, completely transforming our home heating system. And that's spectacularly complicated to do rapidly. And then another big aspect of that is we need immense improvements in energy efficiency. So one of the most important aspects was that we need to increase the energy efficiency of all our homes and offices. And that can't be done, that won't be done without government involvement, really quite accurate, and government funding. And they have shied away from that. Then on moving to electric cars, well, we need chargers everywhere. And that is, again, a huge investment program, which hasn't happened. So that's where government could have been bolder, but it doesn't want to spend the money. A lot of it would have been very, very unpopular. Just having wind farms onshore as opposed to offshore is very unpopular because every wind farm is close to people. So governments haven't been prepared to do that stuff. And finally, just running an electric grid on mainly renewables is still a very complicated thing to do. And we're getting towards the stage where that becomes really quite an issue. So these are all areas where planning restrictions, regulation, government support, government regulation of homes that will come in, and they're all very politically difficult things to do. Now, so that's the greening of our economy. We need a much more determined government. My own sense on the broader question what would encourage really large-scale foreign investment? Well, I think at the moment, looking at the uncertainty in British politics and our uncertain trading relations, it wouldn't make sense for most large multinationals that are looking for the UK to invest in the UK, not for the UK market, which is obviously relatively small, but for the wider global market, or at least the European market, it just wouldn't make any sense to come here. That's why Brexit was so silly. The attraction of the UK used to be, an advantage it had at least, is that you invest in the UK and you had the same access to the EU, which is a huge market, obviously, as any other European producer. We no longer have that advantage. So essentially, the only people who are going to invest here are people for whom the trade barriers of the EU don't matter, maybe because they're supplying things entirely online. There aren't so many there, but maybe some of those things, or their market is the world. That might make sense, but there aren't going to be that many of those. So in practice, what's happened since the EU is there are still foreign investors. There's a market here. There are people doing this, but obviously the enthusiasm has substantially diminished, and that's understandable.
As an observation, it seems like so many of these economic problems have political roots in that decisions weren't taken early enough to see the results that are needed. What is your take on that? Is the political system sort of driven by short-term thinking that's not allowing these longer-term changes to take place? Is that an accurate assessment?
I think this links with my broader, I've just written this book called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which is going to come out next week. So you should all go and read it. And I wrote a long piece about it last weekend in the FT, so people can look up the basic argument. But it seems to me what's happened in the UK has been also happening to a significant degree in other developed countries. A lot of the population aren't very happy for various reasons. The economy hasn't worked to their advantage, deindustrialization, regional inequalities, and so forth. They have financial crisis and other shocks, so they don't really trust politicians. And that's been made worse by the impact of social media and the sort of new information economy, which seems to me a sort of catastrophe. It's a generic catastrophe. So people not only don't trust politicians, they don't agree on the facts, they don't agree in their understanding, and there's no one they really follow who knows anything. So in this situation, in the UK, as in other countries, certainly the US, demagogic populist politicians have become listened to, and they work on a cycle of outrage, short-termism, trying to mobilize people through their anger and rage. It's essentially a negative process to policymaking. Now, this is not a context in which serious discussion of policy options can take place. Nobody's prepared to listen, and there's nobody they would trust on these things if they don't feel expert enough who actually does know anything. Though this is, I think, a generic crisis of democracy. And it's certainly here in a big way. And the Brexit vote showed that, because we voted for Brexit without having the slightest idea of what Brexit would mean. Nobody knew what would happen. We had no way back. We could, for example, have said, well, we'll have a referendum on whether we would like to open negotiations, and then we could have said, we'll have a referendum on whether we like the outcome. Now, we didn't do that. So for that example. So the result is it's become almost impossible to discuss policy in a rational way, because policy is inevitably very technical. You need to know quite a lot about it. And the way it works, when it works well, is the leader or leaders are trusted by the people because generally they make sense, they have been successful, and then they employ advisors and technical people who implement what they want to do. That was what FDR did. Pretty good example. Well, we haven't got those sorts of politicians, and none of them, certainly who are serious, are trusted in that way. This is the underlying vicious circle, I think. Can that be changed? I honestly don't know. But if it can't, then what really worries me is we're going to be stuck in this essentially near no growth economy. There will be some really successful people in it. People working for the world economy and so forth who do fine, but lots of people's lives will be stagnant or getting worse. They will get angrier and more desperate, and they will be increasingly prone to electing more populist demagogues. And then we get caught in what I think of as the Latin American spiral, in which you never escape from this sort of situation because nobody's trusted enough to do the sort of things that are needed to change the direction. And of course, the things you have to do get more and more difficult because you're increasingly far behind. So this is terrifying. I mean, in this respect, I have to say, I don't know where it'll end, but I've been rather encouraged to see what the Biden administration has been able to do, some quite ambitious programs, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, which is obviously misnamed. But we haven't done anything equivalent to that, alas. We don't have the leaders prepared to do it. And of course, the US always has a degree of freedom we don't. But I think Britain just has a particularly bad case. The upside in Britain is that there aren't, and this is important, we don't have the depth of cultural division that the US does. Some of the totemic cultural issues you have in the US, abortion, gun rights, LGBT issues, even racial issues, are nothing like as intense in the UK as in the US. I mean, obviously they're all there, but we didn't have slavery in this country. This changes the nature of a very high proportion of African British, as it were, are actually Africans. It's a completely different history. And so, and you have to say that the Conservative Party looks from this point of view rather impressive, full of Africans and Indians and at the top, the very top. So I think we don't have a culturally and socially divided country in the same way as America. That's a big plus. The downside is we have a far weaker economy, and we have a fundamentally incompetent parliamentary leadership now, and no real idea what to do about our economy. And then we could get trapped that way. But it's different from the US with some strengths. I mean, for example, we got rid of Liz Truss and nobody died, as I said, it was peaceful. And so in that sense, the institutions still work. What the institutions don't do anymore is start articulating serious policy proposals and serious directions to get us out of the mess. We haven't had that now. Well, certainly not since Tony Blair got elected, and arguably not since the early 80s.
All right, we've got about a little under 5 minutes. So and thank you for that. And now that I know you about the book, I hope we can have you back to dig into that question.
We can talk on that too, but it is linked, and I'm giving a little plug.
Yes. Really quickly, I don't know if we can do this quickly, but you mentioned the Northern Ireland Protocol. Could you just dig into a little bit about that really quickly before we wrap in a couple of minutes?
Okay, fairly simple. When we decided to have Brexit, we didn't consider what would happen in Ireland at all. And we discovered fairly quickly in British politics, amazing we hadn't considered it before, that leaving the EU threatened to create a border in Ireland between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, And while we were in the EU, and after the so-called Good Friday Agreement, which I won't go into, but basically delivered peace in Northern Ireland after a pretty horrible civil war lasting 40 years or so. Yeah, roughly. Yes, about 35 years. So, and that all was predicated on everybody meaning the EU. Then, so what they did then is that, well, we've got to reach a new deal. And at the very last minute, and I won't go through all the history of Theresa May's deal, now, Boris Johnson agreed that we will fix this by not having a border in Ireland. So the Northern Ireland would essentially be in the EU single market and customs union. That, of course, meant, from the EU's point of view, that there had to be a regulatory barrier, at least, in the Irish Sea, because otherwise goods that were outside the EU's regulatory framework, namely British goods, could go into Ireland without being controlled. And Boris Johnson agreed to that. Whether he understood it, I have no idea. As soon as, of course, this began to be implemented, it created a huge problem because it divided Britain, the mainland Britain, from Northern Ireland, and the Ulster Unionists, for whom that is the issue because they want to be British, not Irish, got very, very, very upset. So it's proved immensely divisive in Northern Ireland between the Republican tradition and the Ulster Unionists, which is exactly what the Good Friday Agreement was designed not to do, to prevent. And of course, it's very divisive in the Conservative Party because they're a unionist party and they don't want to give a bit of our country to the EU, which is effectively what we've done. How can this be resolved? Well, the answer is, and I won't go into it anymore, with enormous difficulty. And so far we've avoided it, we've failed to resolve it. And the British government still has on the books, I believe, a law which they haven't implemented, which essentially says we're going to, well, we're just going to ban, we're going to repudiate the agreement. And if we repudiate, which actually legally we could, but as soon as we do that, the EU is going to say, well, in that case, the withdrawal agreement is void. And then we are really in trouble because that will affect everything else. So we basically, the simple truth is Brexit created a crisis in Ireland, inevitably so, and nobody thought about it much, and nobody actually yet knows how to fix it.
All right, on that upbeat note, Martin Wolf, thank you so much. I know you do need to leave. I did want to just let our audience know about a couple, we have an upcoming event on Thursday about India and its foreign policy. That's at 11. So please feel free to share RSVP. And again, we are a nonprofit. So if you are out there and watching and like our programs, please do consider donating to support these programs. I appreciate it. Martin Wolf, you're fantastic. Thank you so much. I hope we can have you back to talk more in depth about the book down the road. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Well, it's been fascinating and thank you very, very much.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Bye.